In this video, we're going to take a look at the difference between errors of law and errors of fact, and really what leads to the appeal process and some of the possible results of an appeal. Okay, but before we get to that, we do have to discuss the two different types of errors that can occur, because remember, what an appeals court is deciding is not the guilt or innocence of a criminal defendant, and not who will win a lawsuit in a civil case, but all they're deciding is whether or not there was a mistake made at the trial court or a lower appeal court. And those mistakes are called errors, either an error of law or an error of fact, and you're going to see that only one of these two can actually be the basis for an appeal. So if you take a look at errors of fact, okay, these are mistakes made by the jury or judge when evaluating the evidence. All right, so when you look at like a general legal example of an error of fact, it would be a jury convicts an innocent person. Okay, that's the general legal example. A jury convicts an innocent person. Whereas an error of law is a legal mistake made by a judge, jury, or attorney. Okay, so an error of law, a general legal example of that would be if a judge allowed in evidence that should not have been allowed into the trial. Okay, now as far as appeals go, the only type of appeal that can be heard is one based upon an error of law. Okay, so an error of fact, in other words, can't be the basis for an appeal. The appeal would be based on it's kind of, I really didn't do it. That would be the appeal. Well, if that was the case, then any convicted criminal defendant could appeal just saying they didn't do it. But it's not about facts. It has to be a legal mistake. The idea is that if an error of fact occurred, the jury screws something up and just makes the wrong decision, that's not appealable. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a little video clip of a real life case of an inside trader who was convicted of securities fraud and some potential appeals that he could have. And then we'll take a look at what some of the possible results of this case could end up being.
With the guilty verdicts in the Rajaratnam case, we take a look at the likely appeal process. And joining me now to help sort that out is Tom Dewey, co-founder of the law firm Dewey, Pegno & Kramarski. He is a commercial litigator whose practice emphasizes securities, international, and intellectual property matters. We were just talking about the appeal process here during the commercial break. Tom, on what basis is he going to appeal at this point?
Lisa, I think the main focus of his appeal is going to be that the judge should not have let in all of the wiretaps that proved to be such devastating evidence against Mr. Rajaratnam. I think that is really where the defense is going to focus on this appeal.
Why not use the wiretaps? We've been talking about that being critical to this case. It's something that we haven't seen in prior cases of this nature. Why is that such, I don't want to call it a big deal, but why was that so sort of precedent setting?
Well, as you say, this was the first time the government had made very widespread use of wiretaps in a sort of white-collar insider trading case. I think that the focus of the defense is going to be the government should not have been permitted to play these at trial because the search warrant that allowed the government to grab this evidence didn't permit the tapes to be admitted. That was the focus of their argument before Judge Holwell, who was the trial court judge, and that will be the key thing they'll argue on appeal.
So, the issue here, this is after the criminal case concluded, and we have a conviction for securities fraud, insider trading. And the appeal, or the potential appeal, is going to be based on a claim that wiretap evidence should not have been admitted into the trial by the trial judge. In other words, there was an error of law, because a wiretap, which is basically a microphone is planted either within a structure or on a telephone to record conversations, is a form of a search. And so what the defense is claiming in this case is that the search was illegal. And if that search was illegal, then the evidence, the recordings in this case, should not have been admitted into the trial. And so what they're asking for is for the appeals court to overturn the conviction. Now remember, that does not mean that the defendant goes free. It simply means that the defendant will have a new trial, but this time with the error of law corrected. And that's what we're going to kind of just review a little bit here. But there are three possible results of an appeal. Okay, the first result is that the appeals court refuses to hear the case, and that's possible. If an appeals court refuses to hear the case, then the trial or lower court decision stands. So in this case, if the first appeals court chooses not to hear the case, then the conviction stands and the case is over. Okay, a second possible result is that the appeals court hears the case but agrees with the trial or lower court. So in this case, an appeals court would listen to the case, but they would decide that the wiretaps were legally obtained and therefore the evidence, the recordings, were admissible in the trial. And in that case, again, the trial court decision stands. Okay, and then the final potential result is that the appeals court not only hears the case but also disagrees with the lower court, in this case the trial court. And so if that was the situation in the example we looked at, that would mean that the appeals court agrees that the search was illegal, the wiretaps were illegal, and so the evidence that was found within those wiretaps would be inadmissible in a court of law. Now there are a couple situations that can occur there. Okay, first of all, the losing side can appeal this decision to a higher court. So in other words, if we would assume that this appeal was heard by the New York State Supreme Court, the losing side in this situation would be the prosecution, and the prosecution can appeal that decision to a higher court. The only higher court that could hear it would be the United States Supreme Court. So that's one option they have. Or they can retry the case, because remember, the appeals court disagreeing with the trial court and saying that the wiretaps were illegal doesn't mean that the defendant goes free. It simply means that the defendant can have a new trial, but in this case the evidence from the wiretaps would be inadmissible. So another choice that the prosecution has as the losing side would be to retry the case, but with the error of law corrected. So like I said, that would mean that the wiretap evidence would be inadmissible. Now sometimes the correction of an error of law may be so devastating to the prosecution's case that they cannot retry the defendant. An example of that would be in a drug possession case. If the defendant successfully appeals that the search that turned up the drugs was an illegal search, then retrying the case with a correction of the error of law would mean trying a case for drug possession in which the drugs themselves are not admissible, and that's a near impossibility. Okay, so that's the result of an appeal. We're going to look at the court system and the U.S. Supreme Court in particular, and the concept of judicial review within this lesson. But this is just the general idea of an appeal. The idea is, for an appeal to occur, there must have occurred an error of law. In other words, a legal mistake made in the trial court or in the lower court. If the appeal is found in favor of the appellant, the person who filed the appeal, that doesn't mean in a criminal case that they're set free. It just means that they can get a new trial with the error of law convicted or fixed. In a civil case, it doesn't mean that the other side wins the lawsuit. It simply means, again, that the trial can be redone, but this time with whatever mistake was made fixed. And so these are the possible appeal results in a generic form, and that's something that we'll look at throughout the remainder of the course.